So now I'd like to hand it over to Maya Gonzalez. Thank you, Maya.
Hola, darlings. I'm so excited to be here. And let's get ourselves started. I'm going to start sharing my screen and get my clicker in place. So there are some folks who are new today, so it'll be a little bit tricky. There will be some spots where you will be missing some of the information, the foundation, but hopefully you can access that information. It sounds like through the recording from before. Okay, so let's get started. And do feel free to tell me to slow down. I'm going to try to go slow in a sane way. But I do understand that I get excited and I talk fast. So, in a few places, I'm going to kind of, because of that, in service to that, I'm going to try and keep things sort of tight. All right. So to begin with, we want to acknowledge that we are on Ohlone land, and this is something that actually unites the lands of the indigenous that we're on. It's the language that these were communities, families that shared a language. I always think about that in terms of the Ramaytush being here and the different tribes that are all up and down our coast, and to be here present with the spirits as well as the history of the experiences that the indigenous people have had here. So this is very relevant to my work as we learned last week, and can feel that continuing today. And I'm just going to give a really quick overview. Today is really going to be about mindset. I want folks to really take a moment to be with yourself, like kind of look at the assumptions that you have, a lot of the things that you have attachment to, and take this moment to just relax into seeing yourself. This is a non judgmental space. I always hold tons of compassion because we've all been so heavily trained in this. And then we're going to look at we can implement different ways to engage these things in playful ways. And there's going to be a kid framework because early childhood ed is part of what I focus on, but this stuff is relevant throughout the ages. And I have some materials that are being developed in relation to that too. So we're going to look at those. I'm not going to go over these really closely. The main thing I want to focus on is that if there's anything that you want to share and you don't want to share it yourself, you can private message us and we can bring that question forward. Okay. And I also encourage folks to have one person from their group to share out what is going on. All right, here we have. And then also there will be PDFs of tips and references that you can access at the end of next Wednesday. And the one other thing I want to say is that I use umbrella terms. This is something that's relevant. I use queer, trans, intersex as my umbrella terms. We could use the LGBTQIA, you know, plus 2 plus, we could use all of them. But what I notice that they change all the time. And so I use kind of these bigger umbrella terms to just kind of keep things simple and to focus on unity, right? And then that we see that there's nuance within that. So I consider this sacred work. And so I invite people for a moment to actually call your full self in. You're welcome to close your eyes during this time, keep them open, whatever feels cozy to you. But I do invite you to feel your gravity, feel that weight holding you to your chair. I always say that this is Parent Earth reminding us that we belong here and that gravity is quite literally that action of holding us here. So here we go. I call my power in from the north and the south. I call my power in from the east and the west. I send my love up into the sky and I send my love down into the earth. May I be in right relationship always, first and foremost, with myself. May I be in right relationship to all beings here in this perfect moment where I belong. So, from this place, darlings and non darlings, let's begin. So, as we really covered last week, we begin with this nature based framework. This is focusing on body, gender, and behavior, relationship diversity across all realms of nature where they apply, right? So we looked at plants, we looked at underwater animals, we looked at land animals, and we landed on humans. And we really saw that everything is on a continuum, that it goes through these bigger circles than we can just put into a binary, right? So, with this foundation of this continuum, this diverse, inclusive base, We then look at what's been laid on top of that, right? We look at the origins of oppression, we look at the tools, and as well as the impact and how that's changed how we look at gender and body diversity even now. So once we can see through everything that has been laid over nature's ways, then we can have this holistic framework of gender inclusion where we really can include everyone. But because this has gone on for so long, right, it's going to take a process of really cycling through in a sense. And we see here that we need to constantly go back to that nature base, make ourselves aware of what's happened. Remember the continuum, remember how we've been conditioned by the binary, then go in with that information alone. We can't fully understand how it's impacted us in these different ways. So then really going into the decolonizing, and another word for decolonizing really is healing, healing from the damage of oppression and the impact of that really. So we look at the origins, we look at the tools, right? We pay attention to all of that. Again, looking at how to take those things apart for ourselves, heal those places, find our attachments. Where do we still feel like even, I often call it nostalgic ideas of like, I want to keep this idea and be like, well, I see how that doesn't serve me or serve the larger system. And then how we go into that holistic framework again and again. So this is how we then take that, all of that information, that reorientation, and how we apply it, how we implement it. Because as much as I love the big ideas and I think they're important, I'm also very brass tacks. Like, how do we bring this into the classroom? How do we bring this into therapeutic settings, into housing, into everything, right? So today we're going to look at mindset. And this is, again, that opportunity for you to become aware of your own biases, your own assumptions, and even like these nostalgic attachments to the way things were, the way things have always been for us, right? If you haven't had to push against this kind of oppression, then a lot of times this can be disorienting and take some time to really understand, right? And how this has then impacted our language. So we're then going to look at language and how we can play with that. Okay, so on we go. Initially, we're going to begin with awareness of this thinking. And we always, because we're focusing on kids, we're going to use really playful frameworks and really simple frameworks. But these are just as powerful, just as important for adults. And I'm going to translate that sometimes into how this can then be applied to adults. Okay. So, what does the gender wheel tool do? We looked at this briefly in relationship to the bigger concepts last Wednesday, and now we're going to look at the specific tool more closely. So, we see already that it's actually a physical tool, right? And I think this is really important. So, we get to understand some of the things that we don't get to experience when it's just this symbol, right? So, it's very intentionally engaging. We want the somatic, the nonverbal, the symbolic, right, to be brought into play. We don't want this to be something that is just laid on kids. We want it to be actually physically, emotionally experienced and tactile, right? And how this then impacts our mindset. We can start physically actually tracking how things are interconnected. And it gives us this place to start making sense out of really big concepts that we were talking about, like nature's infinite diversity and how it interacts in all those ways and this constant flow, as well as our unique place in it, so that we can actually find what I call a snapshot of infinity and where we belong, right? So this is really important. Okay. So we're going to play a video that goes into it a little bit closer. Well, now that we have our fabulous personal tool, let's dive into it a little bit deeper so we know how to use it. And let's look at the actual educational tool here, okay? So what's really cool about it is that it comes apart. And what this shows us is that all of these elements are literally nested into each other. Instead of being sort of piled on top of each other like we have to do in the project, this is showing the interconnectedness, the nesting, the wholeness, right? This is what we're trying to communicate with all of these elements. So Speaking of wholeness and looking at continuums and how things are interconnected, let's begin with the body circle. And let's go really slow here. So there's some new words and things to understand, expand our minds, right? A couple of big concepts. So let's look at the outside first. So we notice it says body circle, but it also says small gametes, and then we also have intersex, trans, and we have large gametes and large gametes, right? Intersex, trans. So what are large and small gametes? Well, those are actually the technical terms for egg and sperm, right? So a large gamete would be an egg. So somebody who looks like their body would create large gametes, create eggs, would be assigned female at birth. And if we look over here at small gametes, that's the technical term for sperm. And so that would be a body that looks like it would produce sperm, or a body that would be assigned male at birth, okay? So we notice there's a flow. So we go from large gametes to trans large gametes. And then we go into intersex, small gametes. So we have variation happening here. And then we go into small gametes again, small gametes, trans over here on the other side of the wheel, and intersex, and then back over here to intersex on this side of the wheel with large gametes. So you can see that flow going all the way around. If we take an even closer look at the wheel, at the inside of it, we can actually see how those are expressed in our bodies. So we have genotype here and phenotype. Well, you probably are guessing what genotype means. That's your genes. So we have all of the genes along here, and they include, are we noticing this interconnectedness? Every single body along this entire inside genetic circle has an X. All bodies have an X. But then there are variations. How many X's do you have? And do you have Y's? So you'll notice that the ones with the X's are on the large gamete side. So that would be assigned female, right? And then we have this small gamete on this side would be assigned male, right? And then we have this in-between spaces that connect everything and create that interconnected wholeness, which are the trans and the intersex bodies, right? So all of this, so let's look at this a little bit closer. So genotype, phenotype. Okay, so what's a phenotype? So this is actually really important because this is how we generally assign bodies, right? A phenotype is what a body looks like. So that could be, it looks like it would produce sperm. It looks like it would produce egg. So that's how we create our assignments. Most people are not genetically tested, to be perfectly honest. So a lot happens on the phenotype, on how we assign bodies based on assumptions. So we see this flow going all around. Now, something happens when you put all bodies together at the same time and you pay attention to the phenotype and the genotype. So let's just say, okay, well, surely we can divide these bodies into two groups, right? There's still a binary happening here, right? And nature is so magic, it actually breaks that binary down. You see these two little polka dots here, these two little circles? These actually are indicators of a window that exists that we can see here. So remember, what is usually considered the assumption with an XX would be a body that is assigned female at birth. But what we find here is that this genetic XX has a body that looks like it produces sperm, or a body that looks like it should be assigned male at birth, but genetically is what we would call female, right? So it opens that window. You can't ever divide anything, all the bodies, through either genotype or phenotype. Well, let's look over here just to make sure. So body, here's a body that genetically would be what we would call assigned male, XY, right? It's got that Y on there. But look at the phenotype. The phenotype shows us that it looks like a body that would be assigned female. Again, the genotype and the phenotype are always reminding us that there's this open window that can never divide bodies into just two, right? It's always a continuum. There's always interconnectedness and overlap. So this style we also notice with the inside circle, so that all of these are also on a continuum. It goes from masculine to androgynous to feminine to androgynous and all the points in between. So these words are things that are documented within the LGBTQI plus community. You may not have experience with them, but they do exist. They are real. But if these words didn't exist, if all of these vanished and we only had the energy of our inside feeling, we would still be able to feel that flow that moves through all bodies, right? These words could change over time. They do change over time. But that energy that flows remains the same, right? Those are the bigger concepts. Now, the really cool part is that for 150 years, we have been trying to find a pronoun that includes all people at the same time without having to put gender overlays onto them. So our pronoun circle includes a lot of those words that people have used, as well as ones that we're familiar with, the she, the he, the they, right? So this starts showing that there are so many different ways that we can use pronouns and we can free ourselves. And then, of course, this center circle, which is actually one of my favorite parts, shows how we're all connected. We all come from the creative force. We all arrive here through that power, right? So this shows the full concept of the gender wheel. All right. And then we're actually going to share another little, it's a GIF more like, that shows a character actually being found on the gender wheel so you can see how it functions. Oh, oops, I got to shift over. Here we go. Oh, and I wanted to say that project of the gender wheel you saw at the beginning, we also have that you can download and create yourself. All right, so there we go. So here we see Ernesto, and I move, this is one of the characters from our card deck, which we'll see next. And so they're actually on the gender wheel. So we see their body and their character right there. And then we see their inside feeling. So they were assigned female. Their inside feeling is, let's just look at it one more time. So here we see so they were assigned female at birth. They feel boy, solid boy inside, and they use, there it is, he pronoun. And of course, they come from connection with all people. There we go. Ernesto, hola. And then we can do this with all of the kids, actually. And actually, I'm going to stop this one more time. Oh, I just go to the next one. Okay. So the tool is this really great thing to use. And the fact that you can then download it now and you can create a paper version allows everyone to use it if they want to. Hopefully we'll have the physical tool out very soon. So this is a great thing to talk about, to actually ground yourself in different settings. It could be a clinical, a therapeutic, educational setting. And what it does is it provides this ability for you to focus and be able to support kids in this experience in this very physical way. And this is really beneficial for kids. I once spent an hour talking to a child at a conference, and they didn't have a lot of words or ways to talk, but the tool provided them with the way to express what was going on for them in a way that they didn't even have access to at that moment. And then we have different ones that you can use so that this is a developmental toy that kids can play with, right? Because of the tactile, because of the looking, because of how you line things up and figure things out, and can use the cards as well, as that this is a way to also engage all of those interactive ways to work with kids. Okay. So we're going to start looking now at the pronoun deck. Now, having that feeling of the gender wheel, this impacts everything else that we talk about, right? The gender wheel actually informed the entire approach that we looked at on the first day, and it informs all of the materials that we then create. And we're going to use those then again to pay attention to your own mindset, right? To really look at those attachments that you have, the assumptions that you have. This is an opportunity for you to really be present with yourself, to call all of yourself in. And again, if you haven't had this experience where you don't fit into the gender norms of this culture, the gender oppression, the dominant culture, this may be something that's very familiar to you because you've had that. If you haven't had this, this may be a place where you really need to open up and look deeper and do some of the larger work, right? So what does playing with pronouns do? So the cards are designed actually to expand gender while learning and playing games, right? That's the trick, is how to make it fun, how to make it fun to interrupt assumptions, to dismantle stereotypes, and to embrace difference without even knowing that that's what you're doing in some ways. It offers opportunities to acknowledge the pressure of gender conformity, right? This really calls into like visual, physical experience that we need to let kids be kids and acknowledge a lot of that pressure that happens and expand beyond this like everyday understanding, all of this pressure of the binary that's constantly getting played out. And it just naturally encourages inclusive thinking as well as respectful social skills and empathy, right? It provides an actual opportunity to engage with the queer, trans, intersex community, right? So it promotes the diversity that we want to see, as well as the self-awareness, all in a little card deck. And I want to point out just really quick, I think I touch on this again, is that there's a mini deck embedded within the deck that really gives a lot of clues and hints about how to hold it, how to play with it, and how to learn through it, right? So some of the learning elements is that you get to learn the uppercase and the lowercase alphabet. You get to learn matching and memory games, sorting and organizing, as well as sight words. And you get to learn and practice pronouns, as well as writing and spelling games, all with a gender inclusive backdrop. And we're going to look into that a little bit more. But what I want to say is you don't have to use our materials. I want to really make that clear. Our materials are a great resource, but not everyone has access to them, right? So we also provide clues during this period about how to use other materials. This is really to give you an opportunity to feel what it's like to be in contact, experience gender inclusive materials and what that would be like for a kid. Okay. So then, and we don't do this let's play thing, right? That's the next. Is there a video?
It's not a video.
Oh, let's play. It's not a video. It's an actual game. I'm all video brain at the moment. So let's actually play with the cards for a second. So here we get to meet some of the kids. And what I would love folks to do is choose somebody or a couple of somebodies that remind you of yourself, right? So just kind of begin by playing with, oh, today I'm going to go with, actually, I was playing this game earlier. I'm going to go with Fawn. I really I love that vibe. They're being very playful. And I'm looking at the flowers in their hair and just like that kind of dancey move. So we're going to turn the cards over and we're going to look at what pronouns they use. So I notice for myself that Fawn, uses me. And I really like that, especially in public and educational settings, to have a way that I just keep my pronouns to myself or I allow them to be separate from the whole he, she thing that's going on. So they just use their name and me, right? And I do that a lot in public, especially in group settings, right? Just use my name. So you can look and see if any of the pronouns feel like they resonate with what you use, or maybe they're different than what you usually use. And you can notice that moment is, oh, is this challenging me? Does this resonate? Was this a lot? What if I use they and I get called she? What does that bring up for me? What if I chose somebody that uses he, but I use she? Does that invalidate my pronoun? So really take a moment to just kind of play with that and see where things land in yourself. Notice your attachments. Notice what those feel like to you and what they might feel like to someone else. So here, let's look a little bit more. So here we have alphabet match, right? So we have Jorge and Justice. So what are some things that are similar between these two besides just the fact of their J at the beginning of their names? Well, the first thing I notice is that they both are wearing the same jacket, right? They're wearing that jacket in really different ways. And they both have a sense of style that's really strong, which I like, but it seems really different. I like how their hair is like kind of very distinct. So they've got like some fashion going on, right? So I'm noticing all the things that are similar between the two of them, right? So then when we turn the cards over, we actually notice that their experience and their pronouns are actually quite different. So we can notice difference and nuance, right, in terms of people's experience, even in their similarities, right? So we're wanting really to validate all of the experience and not say, oh, well, because this person's wearing this jacket, they're rocking it the correct way, using he. It's just like, no, you can expand into all of those fluid different ways that everyone is, and that one experience, even one way of dressing, doesn't invalidate someone else, right? So how to play with that. Again, here we do the same thing with Renee and River. And River is actually kind of based on me. So I often kind of lean into that one. And I'm just like, oh, but I love seeing them in relation to other folks and all of the similarities. Clearly, these two are playing up with the dress, with the shoes. They've got something going on, and the hair, the fabulous hair. So it's just like, oh, I see how these two are playing and how they are with their self out in public. But then when we turn the cards over, we get to see, oh, Renee uses he and River uses she, right? So we can see that their experience, and we don't know what they were quote unquote assigned at birth, right? So they're having different experiences, we understand, in how they're using their pronouns out in the world. But there's even more to the story than that, right? So we're really noticing all of how that plays together. So when and how to use the card deck. The card deck is a great thing for grown-ups, to start playing and just kind of noticing those attachments. With kids, it's really great when we start noticing a lot of messages, right? When we're overhearing a lot of those inaccurate, damaging, well, girls have long hair, boys have short hair right off the bat. Girls wear dresses, boys don't wear jewelry, right? So any of that stereotypical stuff, you could go into the classroom and immediately start pulling out the kids, have the kids pull out the kids, right, who are breaking these stereotypes, right? Challenge them to enter into the queer community. That's what the cards are. This was a way for me to share my own community, right? These are not magical made up kids that I've just somehow pulled out of nowhere. These are actually people that I know, kids that I know, grown-ups that I know when they were having kid experiences, right? So these are real people. So this isn't just some imaginary thing. So it allows us to drop into that empathy even more. So if you start hearing a whole lot of, are you a girl or a boy out on the playground, right? This is a way to start saying, hey, let's remember the continuum, that there are lots more experiences, even bodies, than just boy or girl. Use if you have a movie, a game, or a book that reinforces gender stereotypes, and this happens all the time. Use to practice seeing beyond the false binary, that whole boys and girls, he and she. Just be like, hey, let's just stop for a second and really open up all of those bridge spaces to show ourselves, to remind ourselves of the continuum. Used to celebrate the LGBTQI plus community and kids of color, and relapse into the truthful beauty of children's natural diversity. There is one white child in this deck, right? So it's very important for us to reclaim a lot of that gets put out in the queer, trans, intersex community is often very white, Eurocentric focused, right? So we're needing to expand all of our ideas as we can expand ideas around body and gender. Just take a holistic perspective, right? And to be consistent, that this is a way that we can bring in this conversation repeatedly for kids, right? So, oh, let's play the game. Let's pull the cards out so that they have something physical, something that they can count on to help them make sense out of the world, right? To see themselves or to understand each other more. So again, this is really looking at that mindset piece. We're wanting to pay attention to where we get caught, where we're like, oh, but even for queer, trans, intersex people, be like, oh, but I like the girl boy thing. I like playing with that. It's like, I'm not stripping us of everything. I'm wanting us to expand the conversation into a continuum. So we stop landing always just in the binary, right? And having cards and a playful way to do that that includes so many people, includes my community, allows kids and adults to experience what I experience when I go to events here in the Castro, right? All right. So now we're going to start moving into reflection, representation. So I began a lot of my work in the working with race and ethnicity and multicultural within the children's book industry. So I bring that same thing that I developed there to the queer, trans, intersex community, to kids in the same framework. So we're wanting to really show ourselves. We're wanting to provide the way that we speak to each other and how we can understand ourselves within the larger community of nature. So to begin with, we have our first book out that starts really talking to kids more explicitly. The Gender and Infinity book for kids, and we're going to look a little bit at that. We have I have on here one of the most on the list for the most banned picture books for 21-22 school year. So that's our claim to fame. It totally demolished our press, but we're continuing to create those books because we know how important they are. And then we have our pronoun book, the first pronoun book of its kind. And then the gender wheel, where we actually look at the gender wheel in a way that is kid friendly, that is adapting the conversation so that it is in their realm, right? So that they can pick up on the clues. And then this next one, the nature of gender, this is actually a sneak peek of one that can be used for from littles all the way to elders, right? So that we can really expand that conversation and bring in the nature piece and how to play with it. Again, always this playful framework, right? So let's look at the Gender and Infinity book for kids for a second. And again, you can tweak any book. I have learned, and we will look more about how you can tweak any book to really hold things, right? But this is how we get that moment because all of us came into contact with children's books and we're trained quite literally by our environment. So this gives all of us a moment to relax and to just be. So we are infinity. This is who we are. This is who we have always been. So we see the kids centered here in a circle, right? Reminiscent of the gender wheel amidst the trees. And what we learned from the first week was that trees are even one of the places where we can see transition from what we would call male to female happen, right? We saw that 3,000-year-old tree that suddenly sprouted berries, and trees remind us of so many gender diverse ways to be present. All right. The Gender Infinity book for kids. This also reminds everyone, everywhere, inside and outside, is a part of infinity going. When you were born, you became a part of all this. Can you feel it? So, really centering that knowing, that sense of self within children, right? So, they're not looking for external authority to tell them who they are. They're sensing who they are naturally from within. And then also, we can't, that's not the end of the job. Like, that's beautiful and we love that. But if we're not also acknowledging what's happened to damage how we look at ourselves, to constantly put us in this pressure of conforming, right, to these gender stereotypes, when kids are taught to fit into one box, it can be difficult to see infinity. The boxes become everything. And everything, including ourselves, can get very, very small and tight to fit inside the box. So, this is how we start talking about conforming and about pressure with children, right? And using the glasses as this playful way to be like, it impacts everything you see all the time, including each other, including yourself, right? So, and then returning back. So, this is a process. How do we always begin with nature, go through understanding what has been laid on top of nature, then how do we heal that to come back into the truth of ourselves? Because this is who we are, this is who we will always be. Infinity. So, again, seeing the kids in this diverse framework, seeing the animals that they're finding out have all this different diversity, the nature, and how it's in these concentric circles. So, essentially, setting up really that next step of being able to understand and interpret the gender wheel. So, having developmental materials that connect all of these things so that kids are feeling nested from the beginning, right? They're starting to feel that sense of gravity, that belonging, and how that's tied literally to their bodies. And then at the back of this book, I always find myself having to throw in more materials. So we look specifically at the animals, at how they have body and gender and relationship diversity, how this is very real. And this is just this teeny tiny smattering, like I've said, from the number they like to throw around is 1,500 different documented cases of body, gender, and relationship diversity within nature. So this is not isolated, right? And that children fit into this as well. And that we have to go through that. We see this finding your way back to nature on the next page. that we kind of learn these things, right? But as I keep saying, we have to be able to then see through what I call the girl boy lie that's been pushed on top of nature and then come back into this being your full self, into the full colorness, right? Of the reality of nature's diversity. And that this then also extends to language so that we see all of these ways that kids can look and feel inside. Here we have me, right? Using your name, me, but that it can be all these different ways when we shift over, even we see it more explicitly with he, right? So letting all of this expression of he sort of enter into our eyes, enter into our hearts. And again, expanding in. And again, these are real people. I'm not making this up. These would be the she, right? And I'm going to go kind of quickly here because I want to get everything in. They, and again, they doesn't have a distinct way that it has to look. They is a pronoun that we have used to be inclusive for a very long time. And people using they as their personal pronoun is fantastic because it gives us even extra practice. And there are even more pronouns that we're not playing with, like tree and z. Again, these are ones that are being used in real life. And that ultimately come back to each other in we. And again, in the back of that book, I give tons of information for grown-ups about how to hold this. And then we have the ABC book, the one that loved to be banned, because I have the audacity to say that learning pronouns, learning gender inclusivity is as fundamental as learning the alphabet, right? So we go in here where we get to practice through all of the characters how to actually use the different pronouns so that kids get firsthand experience of having those pronouns in their mouth and what it looks like and how to use it. Maybe it helps them understand their self. Maybe it helps them understand their other classmates, right? And simultaneously, they're being inclusive by learning the alphabet and all these kids of color, right? So we're being inclusive and learning at the same time, and that they always belong there. This is a way where there's always space for them to join the dance. And then we have the gender wheel, just a quick snap. Again, using imagery to be able to talk about patterns through nature that we learned about in the first week. And then again, how do we talk about these boxes that nature has been forced into in this very explicit way? Again, this book is a little bit older. This is more middle grade, right? But if kids are having this experience, this book would still be relevant. And how we also place it within Indigenous cultures and how this was carried to the Americas and forced onto the people here. And again, returning kids to themselves. And then here's a sneak peek, the gender and nature, nature and gender, and how this will then be calling all of this in for grown-ups as well to be able to play with. And then we're going to start having characters that are grown-ups so that we see all these kids from the pronoun playing cards as adults, so that we get to see that vision is that we get to elder as well, right? So that we can see that full life cycle and how important that is. So big chunk here, how we start playing with it. We're going to go into our first poll and just kind of read where things are a little bit. And let's see. So once this one gets shared. So this is that chance to kind of start pressing in. I always like, we don't want to shy away from our assumptions. We don't want to know the right thing to do. We actually want to be able to acknowledge when we're like slipping up and be able to fearlessly be with our assumptions and our stereotypes. So when you look at a person, do you make assumptions about their gender based on how they look? And so just like let yourself be with that, right? And oh, right, it's anonymous. We want people to feel like you can just be with wherever you're at, even if it wasn't an anonymous. This is not about judgment. Like the compassion I have had to really develop in relation to gender oppression and how deep it goes for folks, you know, that there's an attachment, and sometimes it's privilege, and sometimes it's culture, sometimes it's a million things, right? So how do we just be with it? All right. So I'm going to give a little bit more time. Matthew's reminding, Matthew's always I always say, by the grace of Matthew go I, keeps me on track. All right. So, okay. So we're going to end it and share the results. And I think it's really interesting. And again, I love being able to see all the different ways this is playing. So yes, but I'm usually right. So this is very interesting about how our assumptions and stereotypes get constantly validated and confirmed in a way. And so how do we start opening up space for that, right? How do we create systemic change? Because a lot of times, a lot of folks are hiding in some ways because it doesn't feel safe. Yes, but I'm trying not to, right? Totally there, always learning. And sometimes. So I think noticing all of these, I think the majority of us are really in that kind of learning and squeezing through. So now we're going to go and we're going to look at our breakout group. So let's look here at how we're going to, this is an opportunity then to just kind of talk it through. Just take a moment to be present with yourself and somebody else, right? And everyone has really different experiences. So we're going to talk more about compassion next week, but let's call that compassion in now, about being present and listening first and foremost, always to ourselves. So where do people learn gender stereotypes and assumptions? Like, where do we learn these from and how do we interpret them, right? So this is fascinating, especially if your early childhood ed, or even if you're just remembering. Okay, so now I'm going to let Leah put folks into
And we'll come back
groups.
in about like 9 minutes.
And we're going to come back in about 9 minutes. So it'll be about 10:59. All right, darlings and non-darlings. Does anyone want to bring anything forward? You need a spokesmodel to share. We would love to hear.
Chat.
Or the chat, right? You could do chat, or you could do it even an anonymous direct message if you want. I'm going to leave a moment for that. And you don't have to either. All right. Well, we're going to sneak into our next part. I'm very excited. This is again how we can really bring a lot of the philosophy of the gender wheel approach into practical implementation, which again, I'm very brass tacks. We're going to start looking at language and we're going to look at it in two different ways. To begin with, we're going to start with, let me click on here really quick so I can do this. The pronoun protocol. This is a way that we have formalized how to basically hold language with kids in particular. And we're going to pause a couple of times with some ways that I actually, because of how I pay attention to kids in particular, that it's different than what gets taught a lot of times right now. Okay, so we're going to look at how we put onus back on the system. There's two things that I notice in what I bring to the gender conversation that I think are very key. One, again, is a systemic piece. We really look repeatedly at the fact that this is systemic gender oppression and how that plays out in all these different ways, as well as because of that calling in the body, right? So these two pieces are I think, what put our work apart from a lot of gender work. So we focus a lot on equity and putting the onus, the pressure, the responsibility, the reality of what's going on back on the system. Because like I said, patriarchy is quite literally by definition based on gender oppression. So how do we put all of that gender oppression back on the system and take it off of the humans, especially kids, at this time? Because gender oppression is quite literally used as a tool of control. So let's look at what it means to put the onus on the child versus what it means to put the onus on the system. So if we were going to take responsibility and put it on the child, this is, I think, where the empathy, the compassion, and the understanding really expanding needs to take place. So we put the responsibility to say they are different than what people of trust and authority have said they are. So a child has to be the one that has to come forward and be different than what everyone, literally in the entire world, possibly is saying is different, and say, oh, I'm not that, right? We put that responsibility on the child to come forward about who they are in this entire world designed quite literally to control them, right? And put that responsibility to know who they are without having any models or free space to explore who they are, beyond rigid expectations, right? So we provide them with this box and say, oh, well, this is how you have to fit. This is how you have to fit. This is how you fit. This is how you get privilege. This is how you make it in the world. And they have to somehow be okay with not fitting into all that, right? We put that responsibility on the child to be brave about who they are in this whole system, right? Designed also to punish them for being who they are if they don't conform. So it's not just somebody saying, hey, could you go fit in that box over there? That would be great. No, quite literally, they could be punished either by their peers, by their family members, by society in different ways, by educators, caregivers, by, all of the above. And often misunderstood, punished, guided, pathologized, and diagnosed by their guardians due to a lack of truth in this larger context. So then even a lot of times when kids do come forward, they're put through systems in different ways. Some of them supportive, some of them not supportive, some of them that are supportive, but don't hold the full story. So are still pathologizing kids in order to get quote unquote treatment or fix them, which we can see referenced in the eugenics core of how gender is understood still in our culture, right? And how that is a lot of the origins in our country, which we looked at last week. And experience isolation, a lack of reflection when we don't have books like we create, right? A lot of people create now. They can't even see themselves anywhere, don't have access to the queer, trans, intersex community, and that being a valuable thing. And are often seen within these different contexts then as problematic, right? Oh, they're creating additional work. Oh, now I have to get these books that have gender inclusion, or I have to deal with the bathroom, or I have to talk to the other parents, and it puts me in an uncomfortable position, right? So a lot of times kids can be seen as like, oh, this is adding more work to what I have to deal with. And this is really important too, are seen as an exception instead of the norm. And what I want to say is that the estimates of what is happening is that 2% actually of kids could have intersex traits or experiences, right? And so this is actually a lot more prevalent than we had originally thought. So this is actually happening all the time around us. And I think a lot of times because there's so much pressure to conform, and because the systems are already structured in this very binary way, kids don't even have the opportunity to come forward or say or share their nuance, right? They don't even have language to share their nuance. So this is when we put the responsibility on the child. So what if we flip it? And this is what I always think about, right? We put the responsibility on the system. This is where the oppression is originating. This is where the control is originating. How do we put it back on them? So acknowledge current safety issues for gender expansive people, right? Start calling in the truth right away. Acknowledge that current language leaves gender expansive people out. Engage inclusive ways of speaking, right? So how do we start shifting our language? Make sure language and systems provide both privacy and support for gender expansive people to grow into personal power and social safety. Again, put a little check mark there. We're going to touch on this again when it comes to kids, because structurally they don't have as much power as adults. So a lot of times the same things get used for kids that adults are using, but because kids don't have structural power, a lot of times it puts them at risk in ways that are very real that we're not paying attention to, right? So acknowledge the girl boy lie. So this is about talking about this strict binary and the pressure to conform, and speak out about the bullying of queer, trans, intersex people, Indigenous, Black, and POC people, right? How this creates pressure to conform to all these stereotypical standards in all of these different ways, right? And how that then plays, there's interaction between gender and race, culture, right? Provide ways of looking at bodies and gender that includes everybody naturally and joyously, right? Not pathologized, not as a problem, not as some kind of issue. Remove gender assumptions and expectations, right? We'll be doing that for a long time. Provide queer, trans, intersex community awareness and reflection. So we're starting to do that with the cards and books, right? Where I'm wanting to introduce kids to the fabulousness of my community, and that we have a culture, that we have all this diversity, right? We have all of these different ways of being. Create inclusive spaces as a matter of course, not in response to having, right, a gender fluid child. So you're assuming that there are going to be all kinds of kids that are gender expansive, right? Not having to do it just because there's one kid or, two. Teach and celebrate that queer, trans, intersex bodies and experience are a valuable and necessary aspect of nature. That's quite literally the thing we learned last week. The point of that whole thing was that, oh, after we look at all of this diversity throughout all of nature, right? Even plants, animals, humans, right? All the body, gender, and relationship diversity, what we find statistically is that it's so prevalent that it can only be seen as something valuable and necessary to any species that has it, right? It's that prevalent. It's not something that happens randomly. All right, so this is a whole shift in consciousness. It's a shift in how we approach. So what does the pronoun protocol do to support this? Is it removes assumptions and it reclaims fluidity, right? It literally puts us back in touch with nature. It interrupts this cycle of gender stereotypes and assumptions, and it addresses microaggressions related to gender, right? So often we're policed through these constant little microaggressions, right? It provides inclusive ways to speak and it respects privacy and safety. So, this is where we start looking at some of the ways that I teach the pronoun protocol that really expands this for kids in particular, but it's true across the board, right? It really puts all of the responsibility on all of us equally. So, it's not constantly putting pressure on queer, trans, intersex people or kids, right? And it preempts exclusion and othering, we will see. And what? It creates systemic change, right? It fundamentally includes everybody all the time. It creates a different way to think. This actually changes how our mindset works because then we're constantly articulating inclusion, right? It moves us toward greater equity and respect between all genders. It creates defaults that are based on respect, right? Instead of defaults that are based on stereotypes. And of course, it includes pronoun expansion. So let's look at the pronoun protocol, shall we? So to the beginning, and anytime there's 12 pieces, 12 agreements, essentially. So anytime you engage any of them, you're creating this uh, spiral, this like trigger that starts creating change, right? And you'll see that it has this trickle effect that just kind of expands. So doing any of them is important. You don't have to do all of them. So as a foundation, of course, always use gender inclusive words like people, person, kid, relative, sibling, parent. It's amazing how easy this one is and what a big difference it makes and how seldom I feel like we engage this one, right? How do we really expand this one into our everyday life? This is the easiest one, right? We're really trying to start with the stuff that you can start taking on right off the bat because the power belongs to each of us. So see people as people first without gender assumptions, which is why we were kind of exploring that. How do we start seeing humans just as humans? Why do we have to see, oh, this is a man human, oh, this is a woman human, this is a girl human, a boy human? When we look at bears, when we look at cats, so we don't think, oh, this is a male bear, this is a bear, right? So how do we start expanding back into just seeing humans as humans? And don't assume you know someone's pronoun based on their name or appearance, right? Very often, as we saw in the deck, there are people in our community that they are expanding perspectives. They want to, rock the dress and use the he. They don't want to go into this. They want to have, the full suit and be able to use she, because all of these positions literally are quite necessary if we're looking at things in terms of a continuum, right? So we need all of these positions. Everyone, every single different way is necessary. So that's how we begin. This is that preliminary way we can start creating a foundation. So how do we extend this further? Inclusive ways of speaking that respect privacy and safety. So here we start going a little bit deeper, and I'll touch in more on the kids versus adults and different ways that we can create systemic change. So use the singular pronoun they as a default in public for people you don't know instead of assuming he or she. Excuse me. Now, this is very common. I'm not teaching anything that is radically different. There are other people teaching this. I have brought it all together as a way to hold it and how this then impacts systemic change. So how do we stop creating these assumptions, right? Well, we do need pronouns. We do need to be able to talk about people. What you'll notice though, is if I'm talking one-on-one with somebody, I don't need a pronoun. I'm not talking about that person. I'm talking with that person. They're talking with me. So this concept of how we proclaim our pronouns right off the bat when we're talking to people directly isn't actually necessary. If I'm talking directly with you, you're not talking about me right now, right? So we can just give that moment of pause to get to know somebody, right? Get to understand who they are as a person. And if we have this way of saying they, if we don't know, we can wait until we know, or we can continue to use this as we see. So use a person's name if you don't know their pronoun. If you must use a pronoun, like we said before, use they. And this is what I challenge people to do a lot, is so often we'll be like, oh, well, using a pronoun is easier, it's quicker, it's shorter. And it's just like, actually, a lot of times it's not. And sometimes the damage that's done by making assumptions to use a pronoun is a lot more than taking the time to say Ernesto or to say Maya, right? Maya is right next door to they, she, he, they, right? It's not a big deal. So practice using people's names. It's okay. And then you know you're totally addressing that person as that person, right? And unless it is confirmed safe space, and we're going to talk just a moment about that as well, don't ask someone's gender or pronoun. It is theirs to tell or not when ready. And I think this is what's really tricky, is in school settings, especially with kids, but this isn't exclusive to kids. This happens to adults too, is a lot of times in these spaces, they're not necessarily confirmed safe space where people can be really present with where they're actually at in their gender journey, in their self-discovery, and their personal awareness. And a lot of times they're asked, well, we're going to need a pronoun, and they're actually forced to mispronoun themselves, right? And they're giving someone permission to mispronoun themselves. And this can be really damaging and challenging. And it's just like really impacts this concept of safe space, right? Somebody might not be ready to share. Somebody might be in a position where they're not safe to share, or it's not safe for other people to know about them yet. They're needing to keep it private for a million different reasons. We don't know everyone's situation. It could even simply be the reality that a child doesn't have the power to exert any sort of agency in their life, and they may be aware of that. And asking them to mispronoun themselves keeps them stuck in that position and that feeling of powerlessness. I'm saying a kid, but this could happen with an adult just as easily, right? But if someone does share their pronoun with you outside of public and educational spaces, I would say use it. If it's a private space, use that pronoun. And if it is a safe space that you've established, and you are sharing pronouns, that you can be fluid, you can pass, you can do different things, then, use that person's pronoun. If someone is sharing, that is a sign of intimacy. So pronouns start shifting into a space of, you get to know someone as a person, and then pronouns become a place where that person can then share more of themselves with you in a more intimate way, right? So having these more public, formal ones, this is a way that we can start expanding that sense of safety. Because what is safe space? I would say really safe space is where someone can freely be exactly who they are without judgment, and no matter where they are, right? That there's literally no judgment. This is really, really rare, I would have to say, especially in educational and public settings. All right, so doing the work to create systemic change. I think this is the bigger piece, and where we can start creating bigger change. And I think this is more challenging also. So we begin with how we can create sort of those the big change in the little ways, right? By changing the little words. Then we start moving into understanding things on a deeper way. Then we start understanding how to create systemic change. Ultimately, this is where we want to be going, right? We want to start challenging all forms of gender oppression and how it plays out in all areas. I have a tweak about educational public settings, which we will see. So remember that people can have more than one pronoun and that pronouns can also change, right? This can be very tricky if people, and especially kids, are like exploring, are playing, or are fluid, and they want to understand how to hold their own fluidity, right? So then wanting to understand that and have people be like, oh, that makes sense. Okay. Instead of like, oh, but you said he yesterday. What do you mean you're rocking she today? Right. So open that up. There are more than 2 or even 3 pronouns. So learn about and practice z, and using a name, like I said before, or tree, right? So that you're prepared. It's not something that all of a sudden somebody's using a different pronoun and you're just like, oh, how do I wait? How do I do that? Right. So you're already kind of in that vibe, already in that knowing. And not that we don't make mistakes. We're all going to make mistakes. If you slip into assumptions, right? If you do the wrong thing, quote unquote, apologize briefly if necessary, and simply return to the pronoun protocol, like be on task and show that you're on task. Oh, I slipped. I'm sorry. Let me get back on task, right? So that you don't make it about you, right? So that you just stay focused on systemic change, right? That's the really important part. This isn't a personal issue, especially if you're not the one who's navigating being gender nonconforming, right? You want to make sure that you're staying committed to what's important here. And then this is the thing where I feel it's really important to establish this as a standard to include everybody all the time, whether or not there are visibly what we are currently calling non-binary people present, right? So that we are expanding the space, we're actually taking the space back to areas that are all of our ancestors, as we learned, not just a few of our ancestors, but all of our ancestors had this more expanded perspective. And so how do we start creating those bridges, right, to these ways that we know that can include everyone all the time? And I believe that we should always use the pronoun protocol in public and educational settings, that these are the really vulnerable places where people are challenged and where we want people to feel as safe as possible. So putting the pressure on the system in these spaces and taking it off of individuals, taking it off of queer, trans, intersex people, taking it off of queer, trans, intersex kids, or kids that are exploring and trying to understand themselves within the context of the world, right? We're wanting them to feel safe enough to learn or be present in whatever way, right? So this is where I fall into, like, I don't believe we should lead with our pronouns. I don't believe that we should ask people or that we should tell our pronouns so that we pressure people into feeling like, oh, I'm signaling that I'm a safe person to share your pronoun with. It's just like that may or may not be true. Now, having worked with multiple organizations where all of the people put their pronouns after their name, I have now witnessed repeatedly where that does not actually play out in the field, so to speak. Assumptions and stereotypes fall into place automatically. That default to assumptions is so deep. And talk about the playground. It is like as soon as they leave the classroom, all of that has flown out of the head. I've seen it repeatedly with my own kid and with multiple other kids, and how teachers are just like, oh, I go out and everything we just did in the classroom is gone. So this is why I believe creating a default of respect, of inclusion of everyone all the time is where we need to start moving the conversation in terms of pronouns. All right, so when and how to use the pronoun protocol. So engaging all of the 12 would be fabulous, of course. But again, I want to remind us that just engaging a few, just 1 or 2, maybe you just start saying parent, sibling, right? Person. This is huge and makes a big difference. I don't want to minimize any difference. And that this approach is then, again, that was a word I was looking for, a cascading effect of systemic change. The minute you begin creating any little change, it alerts people and starts changing how people interact, right? And this is not in isolation. This entire approach is rooted and reinforced by all of our materials, right? Whether they're about nature, whether they're about the alphabet, right? Whether they're about everything. It's that all of this is inclusive in that way. You can use this as a go-to support structure to rely on. It's one of those places where you don't have to do all the homework. You can put up, you can download. We have this available in our downloads at the end, where you can just put this up so that you don't have to think all the thoughts. We're already thinking so many thoughts, and there's lots more thoughts to be thinking, right? Instead of just how we want to use pronouns. And that modeling and the nonverbal is huge. By holding and modeling these agreements yourself, maybe you're the only one in your school, the only one in your clinic, the only one in your area. This will naturally give something for kids to pick up on, for other people to pick up on, especially if you give the reason why. Well, I'm wanting to include everyone all the time, right? This is important to me. And so this is why I'm doing that. I have been in interviews where people have picked up how I'm talking automatically. And I have been in communities and with kids where they will naturally pick up on how I'm talking, right? Person, they, so that inclusion, and you can feel it. This starts casting a spell almost, right? But how do you interrupt stereotypes and assumptions that kids might bring into the space? Well, this is a way where we can start making what I call freedom agreements, but whatever, agreements of sanity in a sense, right? And we have this poster, you can actually see the corner of it behind me. All genders all the time make the world whole. And we look at, we are dynamic. The power of life flows through all of us, right? We are inclusive. We know everybody is valuable and everybody belongs. We are infinite. There is no limit to who we can be, right? So having these agreements as that foundation, this is why I want to include everyone all the time. I don't want there to be any sort of power over or any sort of dynamic where I think one person or two kinds of people are more important than other people. I want everyone to know that everyone is important to me all the time. And so this, even if I make mistakes sometimes, I'm still committed to this core foundational idea. Is this someplace that we can agree on? Right? So that you start inviting people in to make agreement. Can you agree that everyone is valuable, that everyone belongs, right? Can we start there? And so this is a way to start kind of easing into these frameworks. Let's begin with these first few agreements and then go from there. So this is that overarching way that we deal with language, but especially with kids, how do we then bring this into books? And again, I am sharing our books because it gives you a break. It's just like, oh, well, this is what gender inclusive materials look like, feel like. But what about other books? What about all of the thousands and thousands of books that are out there? How do we make a bunch of those inclusive? As a band, author, artist, person, I want to share how we can embrace all books and make them gender inclusive, right? So we're talking about nonfiction, or I'm sorry, I always say that. We're talking about fiction books. So we're not talking about nonfiction. We're not talking about actually taking real life human beings and changing their pronouns. We're not doing that. We're actually focusing on fiction so that we can look at how these stories could be told in different ways and how they're often not told, right? So making the invisible visible. What's great about this is that we finally made it, thanks to Matthew, into a bookmark. I used to do this just like writing notes, and you'll actually see some of it in the slides ahead. So that you can take a moment to look at a book, use the bookmark to have the conversation with a kid. This is never something that we hide from children. We don't gaslight, we don't lie to children. We always bring forward why we're doing this and how important it is. Oh, right. Okay. So I have to go quickly. So I'm going to look at really closely some of the different frameworks. All right. So this is the fundamental opportunity to expand all genders. So we can read with the pronoun protocol. So as we know, using they for characters instead of he or she. What this does is it models using they as an inclusive default instead of assuming he or she, and it helps interrupt binary assumptions from forming. This is really great for becoming present, right? I have got myself completely trained on this now, but it took me becoming present because you have to change a lot of the verbs in order to make things correct, right? And you have to pay attention. If you have three characters, you're calling they, so that you're like, oh, what's unique about this character? What makes this character a person, right? What's nuanced about this character so that you can bring that in? Oh, they with the long hair. Oh, they who loves to wear the clock sticking out of their pocket kind of thing. So that you are challenged to be more present with kids as well as the story, as well as the assumptions. So you can reframe and adapt also with playing with pronouns. So you decide with the person you're reading to what pronouns to use for each character. What this does is it's the opportunity to practice using lots of different pronouns, new diverse adaptations that unerase those who are often still left out of books, and it expands creative thinking. So this is a way that kids can be part of the agency of making this all happen, and it allows them to really understand that they get to, have control over their books too. Oh, okay. And then it also allows for a reinterpretation. So you can also fully disrupt assumptions and the girl boy lie, which we call it, right? So this is a way for kids to understand, oh, the girl boy lie, right? So I want to completely shift this up. So you switch out pronouns completely. So you actually use she for he and he for she. So you can take apart those assumptions at core, right? What this does is it interrupts that formalization that happens for kids about all these stereotypes. This is what he looks like. This is what she looks like every time, right? It breaks down those binary gendered roles and starts really opening up the reality of what nature is like and expands our thinking. And it encourages more complete acceptance and respect for everybody to freely be who they are. And you will find this one can really push on your assumptions, right? It can really kick up that stuff where I'm attached to this character being like this, right? But we want to open up to be as inclusive as possible and pay attention to those places where we have those assumptions. So this is one of my favorite books. We use this book a lot with our kid, and to use the gender expansive way. So because it's about boxes and about the reality of boxes. I'm not going to read the whole book, but I'm going to give you a couple of pages so that you can kind of see how this feels and what this looks like and what it entails. And I've pulled some of the cards out so that we can kind of see, oh, this character could be this character could be that. So we actually use the cards to expand how kids are read, right? So reading with the pronoun protocol. So using they for characters instead of he or she. So here we have, now Patty used to live with a two-way door in a little white house quite near us, but they had way too much fun in school all day. It made the grown-ups nervous. They talked in the library and sang in class, went 4 times to the toilet. They ran through the halls and wouldn't play with dolls. And when we pledged to the flag, they'd spoil it. And so it actually opens up your perception of this character, right? By just changing their pronoun. So let's continue. So this is the full disruption of the girl boy lie. Now, Mickey used to live on the 18th floor with 2 elevators to serve us, but she had too much fun in the streets all day and made the grown-ups nervous. She wrote her name on the mailbox lid and sat on the super's Honda. She hollered in the hall and played handball right where the sign said not to. So this, again, we start seeing a kid that looks like this, right? Who's called she, right? Again, these are kids that I know. These are people that are existing, are real. So reading for full disruption of the girl boy lie. Now, Liza lived in a little farmhouse where only the crickets disturbed us, but he had too much fun in the fields all day and made the grown-ups nervous. He let the chickens keep their eggs, let the squirrels into the fruit trees. He took the bit from the horse's mouth and fed honey to the bees. So again, we get this automatic, it's almost like visceral, right? And it allows us to really press into our assumptions, to really see where we're attached, what we're feeling, and how challenging it gives us empathy too. It must be for kids who are having this experience to come forward, right? Noticing our assumptions, our attachments allows us to connect to the empathy when kids are having to be that brave, when all the authority figures, all the people they love are guiding them, right? Or training them, policing them sometimes into these specific boxes. So playing with pronouns in A Wrinkle in Time. So again, a lot of times people will be like, yeah, but that character was supposed to be she, or that character was supposed to be he. Well, what we find is in these adaptations, characters are often completely transformed. So that's what we're doing with a queer trans intersex lens. This is nothing new, right? So here we have A Wrinkle in Time, a fantastic book, a great movie, 2 great movies, all of them different, all of them providing something unique, right? There are some things that I like about the first, movie. There are some things that I like about the second movie, right? Where there's the one in the first one that was hard that they lost is they got rid of the the happy medium changed in the second one. And I was just like, oh, but I liked the happy medium and how we were presented with this like diversity and fluidity. But there are many things about the second one that I liked. So what we're doing is we're doing that same kind of thing, but with providing agency to the child, right? So here, when my kid and I read this book, we went through every character and decided how we wanted to pronoun them so that we could then play with who we were presenting, who we were showing reflection, representation to in our book. And so queer trans parents, because of our family and community, took a big priority, right? I think we even got mod in there, which is the term I use for myself, so that this changed everything about how we read it. And it even changed me because I then received the book in this much more personal, much more intimate way where I was just like, oh, I hadn't thought of that character being so similar to me. So when and how to use the reading protocol, obviously use it when we want to start creating change and we want to show how to do that to kids. And then again, we don't lie to children. We never gaslight. You know, if a kid says, is that really what it says? Why are you reading it like that? You actually involve the child from the beginning so that this question is almost preempted, right? It's just like, well, how do we want to do this? How do we want to include everybody this time, right? And to use developmental and age appropriate explanations. Again, going back to this freedom agreements where we can be like, well, I know that everyone belongs, everyone is valuable. So I want to include everyone. So that's why we're changing this. Excuse me. So being consistent and persistent is one of the big tricks, right? So if you want to have a significant impact, you have to contain as best as you can. We're all going to make mistakes. A consistent and persistent perspective for kids, because that makes it easier for them to adopt, right? And it makes sense to them. It's just like, oh, they're using it because it makes sense. And it continues to make sense. They can literally witness it. Literally, a kid has to hear this different thing provided, give them the alternative as many times as possible during the day so that they then can model it themselves. Telling kids the concepts and just providing the model as an idea doesn't really take it down to that physical place where kids are going to need it. Grown-ups too, really. And this means constancy and creativity, right? What can you realistically maintain, right? Pay attention to where you are. Allow yourself to grow. Perhaps you convert to using they for most pronouns, or have a special set of books that you use these different pronouns with, or particular movies that you always look at in expansive ways. You know, don't overwhelm yourself from the beginning. Like I said, it has a cascading effect. And even if you change one little thing, then other people will start changing that one little thing too. And then once you have that reflection, that confirmation, you'll naturally expand into the next thing. You'll naturally expand into the next thing, right? It will dovetail in this way that is really beautiful. All right. So,
Go back for a second.
all right, let me go back.
There's a question here that was a direct message.
Okay.
Right
So,
here.
in reflection to 12 steps about not needing, I meant the 12, okay, needing to announce our pronouns. Can you speak to the empowerment that children feel and need to express their pronouns, especially if they are feeling they are being misgendered? Excuse me. So this is really good. And I think this is, our kid is actually negotiating some of this too. And I think that by laying in, so this is personal. So I'm negotiating this at the same time as y'all. So by laying in the systemic piece, I feel like we provide space for kids to feel that agency in a bigger way, right? Because what I'm noticing is that in private and even in public spaces, it's very empowering for kids to be able to say their pronoun. But we have frameworks that are so focused on the individual and not on that larger story and that systemic piece that a lot of times kids aren't educated about what the options actually mean and how they play out and how to give time. And again, this is about doing some of that work about how do we create systemic change? How do we create that understanding for kids to catch that we want everyone to feel included, and that by stating our pronouns in these certain ways that actually preempts some kids who are in these different spaces from feeling that. So it means doing some of that work. Are you going to add something? Okay.
Well, but I mean, part of the protocol is somebody shares it, you use them. You know?
Right, right. Right. And it also, again, and this is where I really trust educators, especially to understand, well, what are public and what are private spaces, you know, what are educational spaces and what are personal, where do we create and develop connection and develop that intimacy, right? So it's not like a equals all perfection. We're going to go through a long time, I think, of understanding how to negotiate this. But my ultimate goal is full systemic change, to be perfectly honest, and to get to a place where all people are included in how we speak. And so this is a way for us to project into the future. I'm not thinking that we're going to solve this in, I've been teaching this for 15 years now. It's not going to be solved anytime soon. This is about commitment to creating change in the long term, right? All right. And how we pass that on to our kids. So here's our next poll to give us a moment. All right, we have the Leah. So our question is formal pronoun. Could you see the benefit of having one formal gender inclusive pronoun, like the singular they or another one? I'm just using they because that's what is grammatically correct and what we're familiar with using, that was used for everyone, specifically, actually exclusively in a way, in public and educational settings, right? So again, that's set up so that pronouns become something personal. We get to know people as people, and then pronouns become more of an intimacy thing in safe spaces with people. All right. Again, these are anonymous. You can say whatever you want to say. And it actually helps me to continue crafting my teaching and understanding. Because we don't want it to be something where it's too hard, or I know it's going to take a long time, but that's okay. We've been living with this for so long. We will create change slowly but sure. I used to say for forever, it's a long dance. It's a very long dance.
One of the answers is double, but that's okay.
Oh yeah, one of the answers is double. That's funny. All right, I'm going to give this a couple more moments. You are free not to take the poll, of course. All right. So I'm going to end the poll. We have a little over half of folks responding this time. And it's interesting, we got two. We got, yes, I would allow everyone, it would allow, oh, oops, it would allow, I feel it would allow, read Maya, I feel it would allow everyone to be more free. I think it would change our mindset in ways we can't even imagine. And then maybe, but I like being called the pronoun I want. And I hear this too, and I totally get that too. And I think that's where we start kind of pressing into the personal and the systemic. How do we hold both of those at the same time? And again, this is going to be a long time coming. All right. So share the results really. Oh, we don't need to do that actually. We're going to do our breakout next. So now y'all have the opportunity to talk to one another and see how things play. Do you ever feel afraid of saying the wrong thing? And what would help you feel more confident using language to be inclusive? So much, and we're going to touch on this tons next week around this idea of confidence and compassion, different layers. Because what I hear from folks a lot is around terminology and not wanting to use the wrong terms. And as you've noticed, I don't focus on definitions and terminology really at all. I focus on those bigger concepts, and that this is actually what can provide you with that bigger understanding of being able to navigate things and come to some of your own understanding. But what I'm gonna do for y'all, I decided this is the first time, is what I'll have for the end of our PDFs and downloads next week is Matthew and I are going to actually create a terminology framework. And what we're going to do is we're going to provide the terms that are commonly used, but we're going to provide a nature-based, decolonized, holistic framework about how to define them, right? So we're going to touch on those because I really appreciate that under many circumstances, you just want to know what word to use, but I want to give you some of the depth behind it and how to use it perhaps more effectively and even more confidently. All right. So now
I'm going to like 48, so just like a little bit of time.
yeah, so just a little bit. We'll go to 11:48 and I will shut up and allow Leah to blab. All right. Darlings and non-darlings. We're going to just go back into our slides. Have a moment of woo. Oh, something was being pressing on something. Okay, there we go. Back to reality. Oh, y'all didn't see that. All the slides slid through, like all of them at once. Okay, there we go. Back to real reality here. Okay, so our gender real approach action plan, actually, we've been creating an action plan so far, is to begin with, we dealt with the mindset, and this is really like changing the fundamentally how we think and how we approach things. And then we looked at language and how that impacts language and how we can start playing with language as well. The different ways, like not only the pronoun protocol, but also the reading protocol. And then I just want to give a little sneak peek about how we're going to extend this out next week. We're going to look at media and again, continuing to interrupt that formalization of that binary thinking and that way of being with stereotypes and all of the implicit bias in media. And then we're also going to look very closely at our environments and how to play with that, how to take steps to create more gender inclusive environments. And we're going to touch a lot on the nonverbal, right? How do we hold things in our bodies? We're going to pay attention to pushback. We're going to pay attention to confidence, to compassion, and these different ways that we can actually be present with ourselves. And we're going to look at what we call pop back for pushback. Because I want folks to have at least a smattering of some of the crazy amounts of research that I've done. And so I'm going to give you some opportunities to even ask some questions. I have tons around religion, a lot around psychology, and a lot of the basic stuff that gets told to people a lot of times to basically preempt them being able to like share gender inclusion. And so also some strategies about how to be present with people who are open, how to be present with people who aren't open, and how to acknowledge bullies and what to do with bullies as well, and how to keep yourself safe and solid, right? So this is a healing framework. This is not about anyone being at risk. This is really about how to feel good in yourself, how to feel strong in yourself, and what kind of change feels available to you to make in the world, because we are going to change the system, right, eventually. All right, I really want to say thank you to everyone who spent this time with me again and took the time to just like be with yourself as well. And I look forward to playing with you more next week. So we have a little bit of time, thank you, for questions and comments. Feel free, you can direct message me. This is a really valuable way to get some extra support and just like have a moment here at the end.
I just want to open the floor to any questions. You're welcome to unmute yourselves or welcome to use the chat for any questions and comments.
Oh, right.
So we have a comment
Y'all
in the
don't
chat.
talk. I keep talking to my non-binary kid in Spanish, but literally every word is problematic. This is so right. Great. I want to touch on a couple of these things. I think that feeling like you're going to say the wrong thing is just huge, which is why next week, actually, we're going to talk more about how to hold space in that nonverbal, because I think, I don't know, you all probably, this is so obvious, you'll go into a space and somebody might be saying the right things, but you'll get this funny vibe, you know, like they're not complete, you can't relax down entirely. And I think this is where the nonverbal comes in really as a key factor in this, is we're all going to say the wrong things at some point, and we're all going to make mistakes. And the definitions and the terms, it's all going to change, right? And there's going to be, oh, this week this is the, you know, correct thing to say, and this it could change in a week, you know. And so how do we have that stronger sense of self? And once we have that, that's actually what we're communicating the most, right? Is like, I feel confident, I feel present, and I want that for you as well. And so that really pulls people forward. And in therapeutic settings, especially, and we'll touch on this more next week, That's what you want to really craft, right? Is that presence, is for people to feel safe so that they can share, so that they can get their needs met, whether it's education, it's social services, or it's therapeutic setting, right? So that sense of safety, right? And then the other thing is I wanted to touch on Spanish is like, oh, we're one of our first goals, and we've been trying to pull it off for a couple years now, but because of some health issues, to be perfectly honest, and financial things, we're still like in the process, but it's literally at the top of our list to start getting our books translated into Spanish first. My parent grew up only speaking Spanish and thrown into an English speaking school. And so I think that's why they didn't pass on speaking Spanish to me. And so, but that sense of being able to hold this information in Spanish is extremely important to me, especially since so much of my work is rooted in Mesoamerican understanding. And that's still a colonizer language. But how do we like still open up for as much expansion and inclusion as possible and provide models? Many queer, trans, intersex people in Mexico are using all these radical new ways of speaking and using Spanish to include themselves. And so how do we make that accessible to kids and families, right? And let me see, was there anything else on there that we wanted to touch on? The wrong thing. It's gonna happen. It is gonna happen. Yay, I'm so glad and appreciate the earrings. Yes, I often try to pull on them a little bit. Like, oh, right. Oh, these. Again, that all of these things are connected, that we're finding that all oppressions are rooted and that so much of it is rooted in gender oppression, right? And so by dismantling this core thing, we're hoping to start creating a mindset, even a physical experience of equity and inclusion that values everyone. All right, darlings. There's 5 more minutes. I'm going to let you all have a tiny break. If you do say anything.
So opening the floor to anyone that has any more comments or questions. You're welcome to come off mute. But I do just want to take a minute to say thank you so much, Maya, for another wonderful presentation and the engaging conversation. And we're looking forward to next session where we're going to be putting everything all together, wrapping it all up, and hopefully folks will have the time to process things and bring back more question and engaging conversations for the next round. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Have an awesome week.